All right, so we are very happy to welcome Chris Wikle as our STEMS seminar speaker today. So Chris is the Curator's Distinguished Professor of Statistics at the University of Missouri, where he is also the director of the brand new Center for Spatial Temporal Statistics and AI, a little bit similar to our STEM Center, similar kind of arrangement there. So he holds a PhD in statistics and also in atmospheric science from Iowa State University. After his PhD, he spent a couple of years at NCAR, after which he joined the faculty at Missouri. His expertise is especially on spatiotemporal statistics. He's one of the world's leading experts in spatiotemporal statistics. And he has especially been working on hierarchical-based and dynamic spatiotemporal models. And in recent years, he has been doing a lot of work at the intersection of deep learning and spatiotemporal models. Yeah, in addition to methods, he's also very interested in applications of these things. So he works on a lot of applications in geophysics, in biological sciences, and environmental sciences. He has also written two very well-known textbooks on spatiotemporal statistics, like what I call like the books on spatiotemporal statistics. I always encourage students to read those. He has many awards and honors. I just mentioned that he's a fellow of all of ASA, IMS, ISI, and AAAS. So we're very fortunate to have him with us today. He'll be sharing some of his recent work on spatial extremes combined with neural networks. So that, well, you can say that they're flexible and efficient spatial extremes estimation and emulation via variational autoencoders. So Chris, please take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikhail, for the great introduction and the invitation to come to STAMPS and give this lecture. When I first heard about STAMPS, I was first jealous because spatial temporal statistics and physical sciences are my thing. But honestly, I'm just thrilled that at this prestigious institution, there was the wherewithal and the fortitude to put this together. And from what I've seen so far, it's amazing. And I'm really encouraged by all the cool research that I've seen and the students and the faculty I've met. So thank you. This talk, I think, is related to a lot of things going on in STAMPS. I hope so, at least. And these are with some colleagues of mine. And I really want to give a shout out to LeCun Zhang, who is kind of the leader of this work. And we have some other colleagues who've been super helpful too. But LeCun got me interested in extreme statistics, and I've kind of not going back. It's fun, but I'm not an expert in it, so keep that in mind, please. Okay, so that being said, okay, so what are extremes? Well, I mean, we see extremes all the time. Wildfires is another interest of mine. Clear air turbulence is getting worse, for example. Flooding, droughts, these are the things we hear about all the time. And the number and intensity of these are increasing, and this is documented, although it's hard to find this on the internet these days. But in fact, storms, for example, severe storms are definitely increasing over time, as well as the damage from those. And things like flood disasters, which you might, if you start, it depends on how you quantify this, but in terms of the number and in particular the kinds of damage being done, there's a tremendous increase. And the thing about extremes is, in the environment at least, is that they don't happen independently. They happen in clusters. And these are recent. I always, when I give this talk, I always try to pick off the latest map. So this was earlier this week. This is the current drought monitor index. And you can see these clusters, for example, just south of me in northern Arkansas, a really high intensity drought going on. We're actually, I live right here in the middle where my cursor is. We're actually pretty good right now, but 2 months ago, we would have been in the red here as well. Clear air turbulence, I flew through some of this the other day. This follows where the storms are. So some of this we kind of understand. There's not really clear air, there's just turbulence. And then fire, and this is not really fire season yet, but even still, you can see clusters not too far from here, clusters of fire events that are already happening. And so not only are these things clustered, but their shape and intensity is changing with time too. For example, it shouldn't be a surprise to you, but a 1 in 100 year flood event now in some places happens every 8 years, right? So in other words, our understanding of tail events needs to be a little bit more non-stationary. Fine particulates are getting worse. And then the time between disasters is actually getting less and less too. And that's another area of interest. So one of the things I'll talk about is in an example later is coral bleaching and the effects of negative effects of that kind of change. And then another one, a big interest of mine is complex physical models. And so I'll demonstrate some of the methods I talk about on a 3D numerical simulation from a large eddy simulation model of a wildfire plume, and how these kinds of methods can help with those sorts of extremes. By that, I mean energy, um, areas of energy extremes. So why is statistics playing a role here? Well, it should not be a surprise to this audience that a big chunk of this is because we're trying to do inference. And we want to do this in a way that we can understand the uncertainty associated with everything associated with our problem and data and the models that we use and the parameters in some cases. And we want to be able to, in particular, say, what if I have a one-shot data set, like a sea surface temperature data set, and I want to analyze features of that, and I want to have some idea about what might happen with how uncertain that might be. And the other is like maybe looking at high dimensional simulation models, like I just mentioned. And so maybe with that, I want to calibrate those models, or I want to just say what the uncertainty might be, or I want to see what might happen under different inputs or different initial conditions. And we do that with emulation, and so we can build, some sort of uh, surrogate model to help with that process. And again, uncertainty quantification is going to play a big role there. So then why extremes and why are we still working on this? And so these kinds of problems that have these clustered extremes don't really work accommodate very well the kinds of processes that we've used in statistics in other areas to model complex space-time dynamics. Gaussian processes, for example, or Markov random fields, or autoregressive models, or neural networks even. They don't really account for extreme events natively. And yet that's really important. That's the thing that drives the inference that we care about, in some cases, the prediction. So for example, a drought in a climate model or hotspots in sea surface temperature. So why haven't they? Well, it's been traditionally pretty hard to develop using extreme value theory statistical models that are very flexible and can be, meaning they can account for complex dependencies of various types over large domains for high dimensional data. That being said, there has been a tremendous amount of work in this area over the last 25 years, or since I started getting into it, and it's progressed dramatically, and it's very, very cool work. I personally didn't get interested in this until I thought that we could actually start using it in really high dimensions. And that's sort of the stuff that LaCuna has helped me realize in the last few years. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. And then this model that we're going to play with, this flexible non-stationary extremes model. And then we're going to use a variational autoencoder to estimate that. Probably in this audience, I don't really need to go into what that is, but I'll just briefly do it anyway because it's in my slides. But I'm assuming most of you have seen that. And then I'll go through some examples, some simulations, and some real world stuff. So this is a pretty non-technical talk, and on purpose, but the papers actually have quite a bit of detail if you're interested, and it'll be clear where that might be important. So there's been a lot of different models, as I said, that have been used to characterize extremes when they occur simultaneously. So think about dependence in the tail of nearby locations, for example. The thing about that is interesting is, so how do you start characterizing that? And so people in extremes have several ways to do that, but probably, in my opinion at least, one of the most useful is what's called to me, the chi-statistic, and not like a chi-square statistic for statistical tests, but basically just saying, what is the conditional probability that I'll have an extreme at one location, given there was an extreme in another location? So in this notation, U is just the quantile here, and X1 and X2 are, say, two spatial variables from some two different marginal distributions, F1 and F2. So if I'm extreme in F1, above some quantile, what's the probability it'll be extreme at the other one? So it's an obvious thing. And so as the quantile gets close to one, then this is going to tell us what the simultaneous probability of those two extreme events happening together are. And so the nice thing about this is that it allows us to start thinking about and even looking at plots such as I'm showing here. So you can see in this case what is the dependence happening as the quantile increases. So you can show asymptotically that as the quantile goes towards one, this chi statistic goes towards zero. And so then we'd say that x1 and x2 are asymptotically independent. So that asymptotic means as we're going towards the perfect dependence, right, or the highest quantile, it's not an asymptotic in terms of number of observations. So Gaussian processes, for example, are always asymptotically independent, which is interesting, right? We use these all the time to do modeling of spatial things because they're great for modeling dependence. But in the tails, two observations are asymptotically independent, regardless of how close they are, unless they're truly like the same process. So in general, they're going to be asymptotically independent. Whereas if that chi converges to something greater than zero, we'll say it's asymptotically dependent. And the classic examples of that in the extremes literature are like max stable processes and Pareto type processes. And there again, those are asymptotically dependent regardless of the proximity. So you can be super far away, and yet you're going to be asymptotically dependent in the tails. And so that's what these two, in this plot here is showing the Gaussian dropping towards zero and the chi, and then the chi goes kind of towards non-zero as you get up to one on the quantile space. So we'll see those kind of plots later on. But the thing that I want you to realize is that typically we have combinations of both of these kinds of behavior, right? It would be weird to have things that are super close together that aren't dependent, or things that are super far apart that are, at least all the time. And so if you look at this map that I showed before, this would be saying like, perhaps if I've got these locations in Northwest Colorado that are super close to each other, it's pretty obvious that they're probably dependent for forcing reasons, right? The kind of precipitation environment, et cetera, has been leading to that. So we know those are going to be dependent. So we need a framework that can handle that. But similarly, we also don't think that there's probably dependence between what's happening in Colorado and maybe what's happening in central Missouri either. So we want to be able to do this. And there's a lot of models that have started to move away from this traditional extreme value perspective. I spelled Raphael's last name wrong there. Hooser and Wadsworth have fairly recently written a nice review that goes through some of this extreme value, or some of these methods that could be used in this context. But most of them still assume some sort of stationary dependence in space and time, and are probably computationally demanding for the large data sets that we care about here. So a good model should have close stations in locations far apart. That dependence should decay as the extremeness intensifies. This is what people have shown empirically. The dependent structure should be non-stationary. In other words, we want to be able to have maybe asymptotic independence in one part of the domain and asymptotic dependence in another part. And then we want to be able to do this in high dimensions or relatively high dimensions. Like, for example, I might want to look at the whole US or a whole North America or something like that. So one of the models that is really promising in this regard is what's called a max ID model. And one particular max ID model that I think has shown to be super useful was originally developed by Rich and Shaby, and then Bopp and colleagues took this over and kind of made it even more general. And the idea here is, I'm going to just go through their model real quick, is that we have some spatial observation, X, and then we have this product error term. So we'll say that epsilon is a white noise process with a Fréchet marginal distribution. So it has a heavy tail distribution given down here. And Y then is this spatial latent process. And this latent process, like often in spatial statistics, is going to be written in terms of a low rank basis expansion. But it's a little bit weird in some ways because in the context, the basis function is given by omega here, and it's scaled by this alpha parameter. And then Z's are the latent random variables that are, in this case, assigned an exponentially tilted positive stable distribution. So that's, again, an extreme value distribution. And the nice thing about that is that the alpha here in this controls the rate at which the power law decays. And then we have this tilting parameter in this distribution, which again, larger values of this correspond to lighter tails. So we have a way to control the behavior of our process through the parameters of the exponentially tilted distribution. But then we also we have the scaling parameters in the basis function and in the overall representation to sort of make everything work out theoretically. Okay. So that's great. That model, like I said, is a really, really useful model. And it's nice because it can handle asymptotically independent data when theta is greater than 0, or asymptotic dependence when theta is equal to 0 and alpha is less than 1. But there's only one class. You can only do one, right? And the reason for that, if you go back and look, is because I noticed that there's only one value of theta and one value of alpha here. And also, I forgot to mention that the basis functions here are assumed to be global. So the coefficients z are not dependent on space. And so you can't really do long-range asymptotic independence and long-range dependence in the same image, in the same spatial process. And the other thing that's a little bit odd here, in our opinion, is that the alpha in the Fréchet controls both the white noise distribution in the measurement part, but also the scaling of the basis function. So LeCun and I decided that why can't we use this model and make it more flexible? And there's several ways that we thought about doing that. But here's what I know this is a really busy slide. I'm going to make it less so. It's basically the same thing I just presented, but the changes we made are really simple. So the first thing we did is we let the basis functions be local, and then their knots are going to be spatial because with a local basis function in space, and the knots are also spatially dependent. Okay, that's the first thing. And then we thought, okay, well, the tilting parameters, the exponentially tilting parameters, could also vary by knot location. So they're also going to vary in space. And then we thought, well, the third thing is that let's decouple the dependence that's in the Fréchet versus what's being used to scale the basis function. Okay, so, and then the last thing was we let the Fréchet distribution have a concentrate around 1. So it's really acting more like a multiplicative measurement error. But the most important part of this was the first part, the local basis functions and the fact that our latent random variables have the dependence the tail behavior parameters that can change with the knot points. So very simple, right? It's like, okay, well, let's just implement this. And first question was, well, does it even do what we really want it to do? It sounds like it would. And so a lot of the effort into this paper was LeCun and Raphael going through and making sure that what we thought was true heuristically was actually true formally. And this is, I'm not presenting this, but basically it sort of all makes logical sense. So if I have asymptotic dependence happens basically if the two knot locations have tail behavior like that would suggest asymptotic independence, then their intersection is going to still be that way. Okay, so that makes sense. But the other thing is if I have the interaction between a location that is asymptotically independent and then one that is dependent, then if there's no overlap, then they're always going to be asymptotically independent, right? So basically this overlap of the basis functions turns out to be really important for us. And then the third thing, asymptotic dependence happens and if there's overlap between two knot locations that suggest heavy tails. So everything, if we'll learn what these local basis function knot locations tail behavior should be, and then how much they overlap will essentially tell us where we have asymptotic independence versus dependence in the domain. So that all sounds good. So it turns out that, yeah, it's worth pursuing this. And we would say, okay, well, it's a Bayesian model. Let's just implement it hierarchical Bayes way or Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, whatever. But it's really expensive. and these models, that's why they haven't been used in high dimensions before, because there's a lot of parameters here, a lot of knot points to be able to make this work. And in fact, we'll end up letting those parameters change in time too. So there's really no way we could implement this in a traditional framework, at least not when we started this back in 2022. So let's think, well, can we use deep neural models? And there's a growing literature on that, and for extremes. And this is probably not even close to all of them, but some of the main ones have done things like built deep extreme quantile models, deep convolutional GANs, variational autoencoders for multivariate time series type data, and stuff that this group has been doing too, and others, including neural estimation and sort of amortized inference or fast likelihood type approximations. And a lot of those have been applied to extreme value models or extreme spatial extremes models because there's this need, they're hard to compute, and those have all been great. So all of these have been nice contributions, but sort of the one thing that, at least when we started, and probably still, that simultaneously what we need is to be flexible. We need to have non-stationarity, so we have to have this different kinds of classes. We need to have efficient inference, and then meaning we have to be able to apply this to really large domains, and then it has to be happen relatively quickly. Okay. So at the time we started, I didn't know a whole lot, but I thought, well, maybe variational autoencoders would be the trick here because it's already naturally Bayesian, and that's what we're trying to do. And so maybe we could take that traditional VAE and make it extremes aware or aware of the extremes somehow. And so just as a brief thing, the cool thing about variational autoencoders is that they encode information with a deep neural net into some latent probability space. And this is kind of cool because it's usually a low dimensional representation. And then there's another neural network that decodes this, and this is the generative part of the model. And so we get back things on the data scale. And so this is used for things like deep fakes and that sort of stuff. And it's really simple in principle to do, and just kind of beautiful approximate Bayes computing in a way. So let xt be my spatial process. I'm indicating it in time here because we will have time. ZT is this latent random vector, which is indexed in by these knot points or whatever. It's k-dimensional at this point, but also varying in time. And so the joint distribution now could be written in, we're going to need 2 components or 3 components to it, right, as we usually would. So we'll need the encoder, which is just the posterior distribution of ZT given XT. And we'll need the data distribution, which is XT given ZT. And then we'll need a prior at some point on ZT. And so we could do this through Bayes' rule if we could, but we can't do that integral, right? So as usual, the variational autoencoder then says we're going to approximate that posterior by something that's tractable, which also depends on some parameters. And then we're going to use neural estimation to make all this work. And so what actually happens then, as in all variational inference, is that we think about, well, our marginal distribution of X can then be decomposed into 2 components. The variational evidence lower bound on the first term here, and then the Hoback-Leibler divergence between the variational distribution or true posterior. And so as you know, I'm sure you've seen this, then the nice thing about this is the variational lower bound is what we work with then, and we can maximize that numerically using Monte Carlo samples, so long as we can obtain these samples, right? So that's kind of nice. So we're balancing then this log likelihood and the KL divergence when we do this. And this beautiful work came out of Kingman Welling and more than 10 years ago. So typically that variational distribution is assumed to be normals, independent normals usually. Those parameters are learned through a deep neural net that maps the observations into the latent space parameters. The prior distribution is also usually normal, independent. And then the data model often is too, but doesn't have to be. And then the parameters of that distribution are going to be, again, learned, mapping the latent process into the output, X in this case. So we have these parameters that are floating around in both the variational distribution and our distributions that our modeling distributions as well as the neural network parameters. And so this is kind of a schematic of how that might work. So traditionally that has been around again for quite some time and does cool things like deep fakes and other ways to do this now, of course, too, diffusion models, et cetera. But it still can do this, right? But what we care about is more emulating things that might have extremes in them that might look like things from climate models or satellite representations or something like that. And so that traditional VAE doesn't make any accommodation of the fact that there's extremes, right? In fact, it's not to say that things, well, I'll show you some examples in a little bit. It can handle, like a Gaussian process can, it can handle things that are larger than an average or smaller than average, but it can't really model those extremes, and we know that it can't. So we did two modifications to this, which is really super simple. We let the prior distribution on the latent z's, in this case, the latent parameters, have heavy tails. And I'll show you exactly what we do here in a second. That's simple. But the main thing is that our decoder now is actually that flexible model, max ID model that I presented, the one that we care about, the one that has all the spatially not points that vary in space and the parameters that control dependence that vary in space. So obviously what's going to happen is that the neural net's going to help us map, encode the information into these heavy tail distributions in latent space. Well, yeah, I'll show you in a second. But then we're going to take those Z's and come back into learn a way to do neural estimation of the parameters of our model. Okay, and then we can generate extreme type output. That's the idea. So the details, again, are mostly in the paper, but as usual in this case, there's a couple things that are tricks. The actual latent, the VAE, the variational distribution here is assumed to be normal, independent. And as usual, we use the reparameterization trick so we can take gradients more easily. So this is all pretty standard, just mapping our observations into the means and the variances of this distribution. So that's nothing different there. That's what's always done in the VAE literature. And then our latent process prior now, this is where we're using those exponentially tilted positive stable random variables. And this is natural given the framework of our max ID model, right? You could pick something different here, but it's sort of built into the way that we wrote our model out in the first place. So we have that. And then the decoder is just a different way to write that model out, the max ID model I wrote in a whole page before. So this is kind of cool. So we have the parameters then that control the tilting, that's from the Z distribution. We have the parameters that control the tail behavior from the alphas, and then we have neural net weights, and then we have some of the other a couple of the nuisance parameters that float around with this model as well. So those are the things that we learned from the decoder neural network. So we map the Z's into that. And all of this is in principle pretty straightforward. There's some things that in the paper, some details about starting values and that sort of stuff. But in principle, it's pretty straightforward. And in practice, it wasn't too bad either. So we get parameters that we care about from our model and from the variational distribution through stochastic gradient descent, working with the evidence lower bound, which we can write out, right? We know what all the forms of those models, distributions are. So we did this originally in RTorch, which I'm not sure I'd recommend that now, but we kind of went down that path and it worked fine. And it's very efficient. We can run these things on fairly quickly. And it's important to mention here that there is this upfront training cost of the VAE, which is as expected, but then it's semi-amortized. After that, we can generate samples from this almost instantaneously. Now, in this case, if we had a new data set, we'd have to probably retrain. And that's why I put the semi there. But in principle, once you've trained it once, you can use it to do all sorts of different inferential tasks. So I just want to go through a couple of examples and to illustrate what's going on. Just to step back for just a second. All we really did is we took this extremes model, let the extremeness change in space and be kind of localized, but yet because we're doing a superposition of basis expansion, we actually get continuous output, right? And then because that's too hard to estimate, we're just using the variational autoencoder to get us estimates of that parameter. That's really all there. Okay. So we did a bunch of simulations from different kinds of truths, and then whether we assume we had a particular type of extreme spatial extremes process, or say we had a Gaussian process, we had a bunch of different ones. And so in this particular case, we just said, well, what actually happens if we simulate from our max ID model, the one that we care about, with known sets of parameters? And say in this case, it's just a 20 or 10 by 10 domain. And this is just showing you what the theta parameters that control the tilting. But this is really what's driving the dependence. And then this is a simulated replicate of that. So just 25 knots, very simple. This only took about 10 minutes to train on simulated data. So the point that I wanted to make about this is that if I took this simulated replicate and then I emulated it with this XVAE, so basically trained it and then generated like a deep fake, then you can just visually, at least at first, it looks pretty good, right? If I took kind of a state-of-the-art Gaussian process emulator, and this is a heterogeneous Gaussian process, so a good idea, right? Can handle non-stationarity. You can see what happens, right? It got the hotspots locations right, but it doesn't capture the intensity that it should. And then it's like, well, how do you really believe that? Well, we have all sorts of things that we looked at to, this is just a simple QQ plot here, but you can see that clearly the Gaussian process, as you get up into the upper quantiles, is underrepresenting what's going on compared to our model. And then this is another, I mentioned before, those chi plots. I like this because it not only shows the chi, but it also shows the uncertainty that we get, because we can generate multiple realizations. So what this is showing is three different distances: things that are short, things that are medium, and then one that is far apart. And you can see here that the truth is given by the black, so that's the true dependence. And as things are short, you can see that there's still dependence going on, right? We don't really get all the way down to zero there to get asymptotic independence. But as you get further away, then you're getting it's less likely that you would have dependence for nearby locations, or for locations that are further away are less likely to be dependent in the tails. Okay, and then as you get far apart, it's not going to happen at all. And so you can see that we are capturing that behavior quite well. And we have some other metrics that are kind of novel that are in the paper, but I didn't talk about those here. But if you're interested, you can never have enough metrics to look at distributions, right? So we have some more, but you can see, just to show you that we do get uncertainty quantification out of here. This is showing a couple of different thetas and the joint distribution of that. These are samples. This is the truth. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that you can see that our credible intervals seem pretty reasonable here. This is just a plot of the truth versus the estimated. In fact, in the final published version of this, we actually have a Bayesian posterior propriety proof that shows that should be doing pretty well. So that was the simulation. There's much more though, so that was encouraging. So those of you who've worked in the spatial extremes world know this data set, because it's used a lot to illustrate, parts of it are used a lot to illustrate things. But the reason why people have been interested in modeling the Red Sea, well, outside of locations of individuals who might work in the area, is because it's an important biodiversity hotspot. Being fairly shallow, is very sensitive to coral bleaching type events. Okay. And so one of the things that we thought would be interesting here is to be able to say, what is the likelihood, or how has the potential for coral bleaching change, meaning clusters of hotspots, literally, of sea surface temperature in the Red Sea. And so we're going to use this model to do that. And I know there's a lot on this slide, but basically, first off, this is what an example of the data would look like for two different periods. It looks kind of like a slug to me, but that's just because the color scheme. Anyway, that's what an example of a couple of months of what the data would look like. So there were 16,703 locations on a grid, and we had 30 years of data. There's a lot of data here, more than we'd really want to analyze. But because we're looking at extremes in the max ID setting, we actually looked at monthly maxima. First of all, we removed seasonality, and then looked at monthly maxima, and then did a marginal GEV transformation because that makes all those max ID models, it's more appropriate to work in that space. And so we did that, and even then we have 372 months, so like 6.2 million observations. So in the extremes world, that's a big data set. Okay, and by other standards, not so much, but in this world it is. So we can train that model under an hour just on a workstation, and be able to do emulation. So this is an example of the visual emulation for this January data, and this is one for December. This is the QQ plot. You can see we're pretty spot on with that. And again, we have other verification metrics in the paper to suggest it's doing a really good job of emulating. Here's an example for, this is a chi-plot now, just showing relative to this location, what is the chi doing in observations versus the emulation. And there's still, we're a little bit smoother, perhaps, as you would expect with a basis function model, but it's still doing a pretty good job of capturing that variability. This is what the tilting parameters, the thetas, look like. You can see there's quite a bit of heterogeneity, which is good. But this is really interesting. If you average those over space and look at them over time, they're increasing. So suggesting that extreme events are becoming more localized over time. But the thing that we really cared about was not just emulating the data, it was to do some inference with it. And so in the ecology world, there's interest in thinking about, again, these bleaching events. So basically, if the temperature of the sea exceeds 31 degrees, it's likely that bleaching could happen. And that's dangerous for the coral. And so what we did is we simulated or emulated 30,000 replicates from our XVAE model after training. And then we decided to plot out the area that exceeded 31 degrees over different time periods in different spatial locations. So we split the domain into 4 locations, and then I'm just showing you 2 different time periods here. But the point is that notice how these distributions of the area of exceedance, first of all, notice that they're distributions because we get uncertainty here, but they're changing, right? And this is, you can tell visually it's sort of happening too, but we can actually quantify that. And I think that's not really been available in this kind of zero-shot data before without doing some kind of arbitrary smoothing or resampling kinds of things. Not to say there isn't a way to do it, but I don't think it's been done in the extremes world before like that. Okay, so that's one example. And then the other thing that has motivated us is to actually think about this as an emulator. And one of the big areas of this center that I'm working in or heading up now in my work is modeling different aspects of wildfire behavior, and including all the way from understanding risk to evacuation strategies to the fluid dynamics of a fire plume. And this is the fire plume dynamics part. And this is with Kiran Bhaganagar at University of Texas, San Antonio, who's a fluid dynamicist. And so things like wildfires or air pollution or chemical releases are buoyant plumes, right? They're warmer than the air. Their density is low relative to the surrounding. They rise up and they usually get transported, right? That's pretty typical. So turbulent events in that case would account for like extremes. There's extreme amounts of energy or something, whatever we're interested in certain regions. And particularly in turbulent flows of geophysical fluid dynamics in high Reynolds numbers environments, it's more likely for this to happen. But those are exactly the models that are the most expensive to simulate from. And so what we decided to do, so as this experiment, and this paper just got accepted, it should be a 2026 there. but it's on the archive too. But basically, we use the WRF LES large eddy simulation model to model the mosquito wildfire in California with some realistic initial conditions. And then we just, for this part of the study, we just took a 2D slice and emulated that. But even still, there's 70,000 locations and 100 time periods. And so the main difference between this implementation and what we did for the Red Sea is that in this kind of problem, the basis function, local basis functions are a little bit problematic. And so in the turbulence world, they would use what's called principal orthogonal decomposition, which is basically a principal component decomposition, or SVD. But that doesn't work for us because we require in our model positivity. And so what we did was a non-negative matrix factorization here and use those basis functions in place of the local basis functions in our max ID model. And then yeah, there's a few other minor things, but then we compared to some of these other approaches. And so again, I'm just showing you the data on the left for 3 different times and our emulated plume on the right. And it's hard to visually detect the difference there. And the QQ plots are spot on. Also, if you look at the chi plots, they're pretty good here too. And I'm not showing it, but it does way better than a traditional POD decomposition that turbulence people might use for this kind of representation, and better than just a vanilla variational autoencoder, one that doesn't have the extremes awareness. So this is just a video showing it, just so you can see that it's doing a pretty good job. The cool thing is that of course, once we've trained it, it's amortized, we can generate many different realizations for this. And if we do that, then we can start asking questions about, how much variation is there at that location? And so this is showing there's 5 locations. It's hard to kind of see them depending on which plot you look at, but there's like one here, up in here. And then there's 3 different time periods that we looked at. And then these are the distributions from running 1,000 emulated samples of this. Of course, you couldn't run this model 1,000 times, right? It's too expensive. But once you do the emulations, it's trivial. And you can do joint distributions here per location variability as well. So this is kind of new. It's a tool that hasn't really been available, and we're just now starting to exploit how to really use this scientifically, for calibration purposes, but also for understanding new cases. What happens if we change the forcing or the background winds and that sort of thing. And then one of the, Mike Hatley, who's a student in our group, is working on extending this to 3D turbulence now. And so you can imagine the volume of data is getting really incredible now. These are very preliminary results, but looking pretty good so far. And again, these models, this is a subset. What I showed you before was just a 2D slice from the same model. And so now we're seeing a different variable. That's why it looks different. But yeah, it was kind of cool to think we could actually emulate this with extremes in 3D. And then the other thing that another student, Xiaoyu Ma, is working on is the conditional version of our XVAE. And so let's say, for example, we know a lot of weather and climate processes are driven by El Nino events. And so what if we include that as a conditioning variable here, and then we can start looking at what's happening, for example, in times where there was a strong El Nino or a strong La Nina. And then we can do cool things too, which we're just exploring, like counterfactual comparison. So what if we flip the ENSO sign around? And so we rerun the model and show what would happen in that environment. And then this is just showing you at a particular location what could happen in terms of under the different environments and the counterfactual versus the truth, depending on whether you're in a normal case or El Nino or La Nina. And again, this is preliminary work, but it's encouraging that we can do this. There's no reason why you couldn't have a condition on whole space-time fields. Doesn't have to just be a time series. So that's kind of promising stuff, in my opinion. So just to summarize, extreme events and particularly weather derives extreme events are increasing in number, and this can have all sorts of impacts related to health and the environment and the ecosystem and economics. These events tend to cluster in space, and it's been typically difficult to model those kinds of processes and statistics in high dimensions, at least. There've been a lot of developments in that space, but still not super flexible in being able to accommodate non-stationary dependence across domains. And so we extended that, made it non-stationary, can change in time as well. And the variational autoencoder really lets us do that on a problem that we couldn't have done before. So these are, the things we care about, at least I care about: inference, prediction, and model emulation. Usually it's prediction first, then emulation, then inference. But regardless, I think you can use these things for all these. And then where we're going with this, and what my big interest is, and what some students in our group are doing, is trying to extend realistic time dependence. We have changes over time, but it just assumed that all those parameters were independent across time. And that's not the case, right? And it's unusual in the extremes world to kind of model spatial and temporal stuff together, because we're usually taking either peaks over thresholds, or we're taking block maxima. And so you're kind of throwing out chunks of the data. And then so part of the time stuff goes away. And so we want to try to do it all in one kind of framework where we're modeling the bulk and the tail of the distribution in a way that respects the dynamics of what's going on. And so this has been fun, and we have some students making progress in that space, and yeah, I'm having a blast. So just to thank you first, but then these are the two main papers that I talked about. It took 3 years, but this paper finally got accepted to JASA. I'd like to say that it's better now. Then this new paper is in neural computing and applications, and we have a couple others that are in the works in various stages. But thanks so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it. Happy to take questions.